Chapter 23, Part 2 is the parts of the central nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. We're going to talk about everything inside your skull and inside your spinal cord and just get a handle on what's going on in there. First off, starting on page 576, we're going to look at the meninges. So on your screen, I have the picture that's off the bottom of page 577. So the meninges are just a connective tissue membrane that's on the inside of our skull, lining our skull, and it does go down, the meninges go down into our vertebral column, they surround the brain and the spinal cord. But of course, there is layers that I want you to be aware of. So we have the pia mater, the arachnoid, and the dura mater. So there is the layering that I want you to be familiar with. That's also on the bottom of 577, and you can see that on my screen. So just know which one is the inner layer, the middle layer, and the outer layer. What's flowing on the inside is our cerebrospinal fluid. So the CSF, this is what is the clear, it has a little bit of grayish coloring, but almost clear fluid that's going up and down our spinal cord. It's in our brain, and it's located within that subarachnoid space. So if you go back to your terminology, remember sub is below, so it's below that arachnoid mater space. Why we need our cerebrospinal fluid is not only to help us when we hit our head, it cushions our skull, keeps everything moving in there as a little shock absorber, but it's also giving our brain and our spinal cord oxygen and nutrients that it needs. But something that is interesting is that if you ever had a time where you didn't sleep at night and the next day you really felt kind of sort of like icky, well, one thing that the cerebrospinal fluid does is it removes the waste product from our brain when we sleep. So it's cleaning out everything as we sleep. So when we don't sleep, we have a buildup of all of that metabolic waste, all the stuff from our cells that says, okay, I got to get it out of here. But when we don't sleep, it really is a backup of that. So it is really important why we have to sleep. So that was the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid. Now we're going to start with the brain. The brain, we think of it as our control center of our body, gives us all the information that's going on further down our body. It is our largest organ in our body. It has over 100 billion neurons. And if you remember what a neuron is, if not, this might be the time to pause and look that up. But surrounding the brain is something called the blood-brain barrier. Whew, that's a tongue twister right there. So this is where chemicals and disease organisms that we don't want, hopefully, are being caught so that they don't come into our cerebrospinal fluid. But sometimes even our blood can contain things that we don't want it to. So just be aware that we have a little built-in wall barrier trying to keep diseases out. So now we're going to move on to all the different parts of the brain. So this is the picture that's on page 579, and you can follow along in your book when we talk about the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. 578 is where we start with the cerebrum. So this is the largest, most superior portion of the brain. So this is kind of like our cap. And you can see just how it has different grooves and ridges in it. Looks, kind of looks like a cauliflower maybe. But there is a term for those grooves and ridges, and that is on page 578, the right-hand column at the bottom, for what those correct terms are. They are not in bold, they are in italics, so give you a little search and find there. But also located within the cerebrum is where we can have our visual input and just how we take things in what we're seeing. So that is the occipital lobe. That is the part where we are looking out. Also within the cerebrum is the brain waves. And the brain waves are talked about on the bottom of 579, the alpha, beta, theta, and delta. But we're going to focus on those in just a moment on another slide. Let's talk about all the parts of the brain, and then we'll get to those brain waves because they are very important. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the diencephalon. So this is located right in the center of our brain. It has several glands in it: thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary, and the pineal gland. Each of these glands is super important for our body. The thalamus is the largest part of the diencephalon. That's our sensory information that's coming in, all except for our smell, our olfaction. The thalamus also is part of our sleeping, our alertness, our consciousness. The hypothalamus is the part that is regulating our autonomic nervous system. We talked about that in part 1 of this chapter. So this is our behavioral patterns, our awake-sleep cycle, our biorhythms, our circadian rhythms. The hypothalamus is also in charge of our hunger, our thirst, our anger, aggression, hormones, temperature, sleep patterns, our sexual behavior. So the hypothalamus and the thalamus located within the diencephalon are very important parts of our day. On the bottom of page 580, we have the pituitary gland, the other gland that is one of the other glands that is located within there. So this is also connected to the hypothalamus, and then the pineal gland is also located right there. We talked in chapter 24, we'll talk more about the pituitary, the two parts of the pituitary gland and the pineal gland. So we'll have more of that coming up later. The picture that's on page 580 does show the different areas of the cerebrum. So they're mentioned on the bottom of 578, but there you can see where the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, occipital lobe. So all of that information that is coming in that big part of our brain, our cerebrum. And then again, the diencephalon is right in the very center. The next part, the third part of our main region of our brain, is the cerebellum. So this, they say in the book, is shaped like a cauliflower. And if you're looking at page 580, you can see it's at, if I was to wear a little bun in the back of my hair, right about where my head would hit the pillow, that is where the cerebellum is located. So this is the part of our brain that is responsible for balance and our muscular movements and our muscle tone. So we always want to make sure when we're doing any activities, we have that part covered. That one is a very important area. Coming out of that area, or right in the same area, is our brain stem. And there is different parts to our brain stem. So the picture that I have on the screen, or the picture that you have on 579, is where you can see these. So the brain stem is meeting up with the spinal cord. The brainstem contains the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So again, you can see that area on the picture that I have on the screen, but it's not shown on page 580 where they're talking about these parts of the brainstem. So what these parts do, the midbrain is our nerve impulse, and that is directing that nerve impulse down into our pons. The pons is connecting the cerebellum and the cerebrum with the spinal cord. So the pons is kind of like a pond. It's holding it all together. And then the most inferior portion, or the lowest portion, is our medulla oblongata. So this is where our sensory, our motor impulses are coming in from all parts of the brain. The medulla oblongata is also where we breathe from, or how our breathing and our heart rate is being regulated. So it also is in charge of sweating and sneezing and swallowing and vomiting. It's a lovely area. So we always want to make sure that our medulla oblongata is also an area that we want to protect. But this is way up inside our skull almost. So the brain stem is coming out of our brain. So sometimes when people suffer spinal cord injuries, it depends on where their spinal cord is being damaged, because even in the brain stem, we have 3 different parts which are going to cause different things to happen when there is a trauma or an injury there. The brain waves I mentioned back under the cerebrum, they talk about the brain waves, the rhythmic patterning on the bottom of 579, but they have this a little chart that's on page 581, and you can look at it there. You don't need to memorize the numbers that go along with this, but I do want you to be aware of what all four of these brain waves are. So we have our alpha, we're calm and relaxed. Maybe you're in that right now. Hopefully, you're more in the beta. You're alert, you're mentally active, you're following along, you're looking at the screen, you're highlighting in your book. Our theta brainwave is wonderful. So this is our kind of our twilight. So we're kind of with it, we're kind of not. We like being in that little twilight. Depending on where you're going in your medical career, you might be doing something like massage therapy, where that is, we want our clients to be in that deep relaxation. So we want them to be in their theta brain wave. I'm sure we've all experienced it at different times, but that is instead of delta. So delta is the deep asleep, you're snoring, you're down and out for the count. So please be aware of the alpha, beta, theta, and delta, and be aware of what you're doing with your consciousness. So again, you don't have to memorize the numbers, but I do want you to be aware of what those four terms are and what the definition of them are. So we talked about the parts of the brain, the four important parts of the brain. We looked at the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brain stem. And at the bottom of the brain stem, we begin our spinal cord. So as I have written on there, our spinal cord is our information highway. So the picture that I have is on the bottom of 581. And if you look at that, you can see where the spinal cord goes all the way down the center of our back, down into our pelvic area. Then it has more nerves that are branching out. So this entire chapter is our central nervous system. So everything about the spinal cord is the main highway, and all those little branches that are going off into my rib cage, down into my legs, that all of those external highways that are, or byways that are coming off my information highway. So what I want you to know about the spinal cord is that it is a bundle of nerves that comes from the brain stem, goes all the way down into our lumbar or sacral area. I want you to be aware of just all the parts that it is covering. There is a little part on the top of page 582 that will help you understand why our why our spinal cord is so important. And it's right at the end of the paragraph, or right above the peripheral nervous system. It says the afferent impulses travel up the cord on ascending tracks, and efferent impulses travel down and out the end of the cord on descending tracks. So this is an information highway. So there's a part that's going up, part that's going down, even though we think of our spinal cord as just being a hollow tube with that lovely fluid floating around in it. There is a pulsing, if you can think of it that way. There is a way that things have to move up and down within our spinal cord, taking that information from my toes all the way up to my brain and back down into my other toes. The peripheral nervous system is where we're going to talk about our cranial nerves and our spinal nerves. So I want you to refer back to the picture on page 572, just to remember that we have the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, and our peripheral nervous system is all of the other nerves. So this is all of the area of the other nerves that are coming out of our brain, or our cranial nerves. So you can see this lovely picture that's on page 582. No, you do not have to remember everything about these, but what you do need to remember, or be aware of, is what does each nerve do? So you don't have to memorize, for instance, that cranial nerve number 1 is olfactory nerve, but you do need to know that olfactory means your smell. So you don't have to memorize the numbers along with what they do, but you just have to be able to define what each one of those is. The one that is kind of unusual is the trigeminal nerve. So there's three different branches, and you can see that picture on the screen, the trigeminal. So it looks like it's going to the top of my head, right about to my temporal area, and down into our cheek. So this one is covering different areas. So it does seem like it's got a whole lot going on, but the same goes with our facial nerve. If you look at nerve number 7, our facial nerve, so that's the one that's operating parts of our face. So some of these do cover more than one area. If you look at the vagus nerve, nerve number 10, that's one that maybe you're a little bit more familiar with because it is our heart rate, our blood pressure, sweating. So this is the nerve sensation, so the information highway from my brain down to connect with all of those things in that part of my body. So the cranial nerves are coming out of the bottom part or the inferior surface of my brain, and they're talking to a particular part of my body. The other nerves that are part of our peripheral nervous system are our spinal nerves. So not as easy with our numbering here, but there is some things that you do need to remember about these spinal nerves. So we have 31 pairs. So that's the 8, 12, 5, 5, and 1. You don't have to memorize what each area is, but you should probably be able to remember that there's 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5, 5, 5, 1, etc. And if you look at the picture that I have on the screen, which is the picture from page 584, you can just see the area that they're covering. So again, when you think of maybe you heard of someone having a spinal cord injury or a nerve in their spine is giving them difficulty, it all depends on where and exactly where they have their injury, because no one's spinal injury is going to be the same, because it depends on the exact area for where that spinal nerve is emerging out of the side of the spinal cord. The other thing that I want you to be aware of is this is on the left side of the picture, that we have plexuses. No, you don't need to memorize each of the plexuses, although there's not that many, but I do want you to know what a plexus is. So it's really just a bundle of nerves that are coming out of a particular area. So the cervical plexus would be all the nerves that are coming out of our cervical area. Brachial plexus covers a little bit more ground. The lumbosacral plexus is a little bit lower, but again, covering more area. So just be aware that the plexuses, or what they are, and the names of them. So just so you're being familiar with the skin or the muscles or the area that they're covering. Also on the bottom of page 583, we have the dermatomes and the myotomes. So a dermatome is just the area of skin that a single sensory spinal nerve is covering, where a myotome is a group of muscles that are supplied by that single area. There is a picture on page 585 at the top picture if you want to look at the dermatome map and just seeing how the different areas are fed. Again, this might help you depending on where you're going in your career. Be aware of how an area on someone can have discomfort or can be having some pains due to what is happening within the nerves that are being fed to there. Also, I have on this slide that we have reflexes. Probably you're familiar with what a reflex is. It is a protective involuntary response, but it's a predictable response. If someone was to come along, or you hit your, let me do it this way because I did this to myself this morning. So I was getting a cup of coffee, and I stopped at the little coffee truck. It was lovely, and I'm getting back in my car, and even though I have the sleeve on my cup of coffee that's hot, I'm getting in my car and my cup bumped somewhere in my car, so the hot liquid came onto my hand just a little bit, and I instinctively said, ow, and I realized I hadn't even processed that the coffee was hot yet. So we can anticipate that I'm going to have a predictable reflex of touching something that's hot. I'm going to pull my hand away. But sometimes we can hit ourselves or bump our toe or do something and we're saying, ow, but we realize that Oh, that actually didn't even really hurt. So just so know what a reflex is. On page 586, we have a stretch reflex. So this is how your muscle is going to contract in response to that reflex. If you've been to the doctor and you're sitting on the high table and they take the little hammer and they poke right below your patella, right below your kneecap, and they're trying to get that response. So that's a reflex, but it could cause a stretch reflex. It could cause your leg to kind of get that jerk reaction and go forward. So just be aware that all of those things are part of our spinal nerves. Everything that is going on within our body does have to be fed out of our brain. When we were first talking about this chapter, chapter 23, which seems like a very long time ago since you listened to that first part, we talked about the central and peripheral nervous system, and that the peripheral nervous system has two subsystems, the somatic and the autonomic, and then those further go into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So back on page 572 is where we first introduced those terms, but now we're going to look at those areas a little closer. So the autonomic nervous system is a part of the peripheral nervous system, and I think of autonomic as our automatic. It is the things that are helping control all my glands, my heart rate, just everything that I want to keep going inside my body that I don't have to think of. I don't want my brain to have to be told by another part of my body, oh, you need to take an inhale. I want my heart to keep beating. I want to keep breathing. So that's our autonomic nervous system. When my food is being digested, all of those things. Our hypothalamus in our brain is helping to regulate this autonomic nervous system. But further, that autonomic nervous system has the sympathetic and the parasympathetic division. So the picture that I have on the screen is of page 587, and you can just see how they're divided up in our body. But what I want you to be aware of is not necessarily what is controlled by what, but what each one of these are. So the parasympathetic is our energy conservation. Some people think of it as our rest and digest. That might be a little term that helps you remember what it is, but it's the body functions that are conserving and restoring body energy, like digestion. So that's where the rest and digest might come from. This is our craniosacral division of our body, the parasympathetic. The sympathetic division is our energy expenditure. So parasympathetic is energy conservation. Sympathetic is our energy expenditure. So this is what we need during our physical exertion, when we're stressed, emotionally, physically, we can think of it that way. So this is our thoracolumbar division. So a little difference in where it is communicating with our body. So I want you to be familiar of the common way to think of parasympathetic as the rest and digest, and the sympathetic as the fight or flight. But really, it's so much more. It's the energy conservation and the energy expenditure and all the little parts that go along with that. So please be aware of more than just those little common terms of rest and digest or fight or flight. This next part is going to be kind of quick because we're probably all familiar with our senses, and probably mostly the organs that go along with that. The one that's going to be hardest is our touch. But our five senses, touch, taste, smell, vision, and hearing. I know some people talk about a sixth sense, just kind of the special sense of something's going to happen and that type of thing. But we're sticking with the five senses because we're talking about where they're connecting to in the brain. So touch is on the bottom of page 587. So this is the one that our sensations are coming in. So it's pressure, movement, temperature, and our nociception. So this goes back to chapter 22 with those skin receptors. So that's what I want you to think about when we think of touch. And all of us have a different way of taking a piece of fabric in our fingers and noting what that feels like. But be familiar with the touch sensation is a nociception receptor. On page 588, we have the taste, which is a chemoreceptor. Then we go into smell. So the term for smell is olfaction or olfactory. So that's the term that describes what's going on. So that is also a chemoreceptor. So it's detecting chemicals or those type of smells. Our vision is photoreceptors. So there is a picture on page 589 of what the inside of our eye looks like. Notice at the very top we have rods and cones. They're showing you the difference between what our photoreceptors in the retina of our eye are taking in. Rods are more active in dim light. There are night vision. The cones are for bright light and color. So just different photoreceptors that are coming in to our eye. Our hearing is a mechanical receptor because we're hearing or perceiving sounds and different vibrations, different things like that. So all of the things that I want you to think about with those senses go into an organ, which then our brain is interpreting or experiencing and then adapting and sending things back out. When we taste something, when we smell something, think of how your nervous system is working when you have that happening. The receptors that I mentioned with our senses. So the receptor definition is on the bottom of page 589. So this is when a neuron is responding to whatever the sense is. They mentioned there in the paragraph light, temperature, pressure, movement, nociception, so kind of that pain thought, whether it's inside or outside our body. We know that we can have a feeling somewhere, or we can have a smell that is coming from somewhere, or my feet are cold but my hands are hot, or that type of thing. So perception and adaptation are what our receptors are doing in communicating with our body when we're thinking about our senses. The receptors in our body are located in different areas. So this is on page 590. So this goes to classification as to where these are located. And if you look at the prefixes, that might help you the most. So the exteroreceptor, so this is going to be external stimuli. The interoreceptor is going to be the internal. The proprioception is one that's a little bit harder, but it helps us know where we are, where my muscles are, where my joint is. It's detecting movement in like where I am in space. So please know where the receptors are located based on what they're receiving. This information goes back to when we first started talking about the senses. So all of these receptors that we just talked about, whether they're internal, external, or they're proprioceptor or receptors, they're going to be detecting things, whether it's a chemical or a change. So the classification is on page 590. That's what I have up on the screen here. So they're talking about what my body is receiving and the transmission or the signal that is being received and the response that is happening. For instance, when you take something into, you take a taste of something, you might detect that it is salty or it's sweet. So that is a chemical type reception. So it's a chemical stimuli that you have received onto your tongue. So maybe think of examples of each one of those. Temperature is probably the easiest one to think of. But so just different things that I want you to be aware of with the receptors. The last one that I have on here is our mechanical receptor. So I want you to think of it as just movement mechanical. But this is our skin, our blood vessels, our ears, our muscles, our joints. But there's two different types of mechanical receptors. We have our muscle spindles and our Golgi tendon organ. So prior to me getting into a lot of detail about anatomy and really diving in and learning more about it, this was years ago, I had always seen articles in magazines or little things about when in working out, that they would talk about, you want to do this because your Gogli tendon that, or your muscle spindle this, and it didn't make any sense, but it seemed like those are movements that I wanted to do because I wanted my muscle spindle to be doing the right thing, or my Gogli tendon organ. But it really has to do with what's going on in my brain, where this receptor is located, what stretch or what thing I am doing. So I want to take just a moment and look at that picture a little bit separately. This is the picture that's on the page, top of page 582. So it's just giving us a little bit of insight as to where the Gogli tendon organ is located. So it is a tendon, which means this is at the connection of where the muscle is connecting to the bone, because that's what a tendon is. The muscle spindle, as you can see on the inside there, means that it is wrapped around, or it's stretched around the receptors inside the muscle fibers. And you want to remember that if something on the inside is wrapped around, it's going to feel when that muscle changes. It's going to feel how one muscle fiber bundle is moving versus the other. So if you need to go back into our muscular system chapter and review how a muscle works and maybe what each one of those bundles of muscle fibers is called, that's fine. But please remember that there is different things, different types of receptors. So this mechanical receptor, it would make sense that the muscle spindle is on the inside of my muscle, wrapped around each individual muscle fiber, is going to experience something different than my Gogli tendon organ, because that's where my muscle is actually connecting to my bone. So I want you to be aware of those different types of movements, or the receptors that they're talking to.